And now it's time for the Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and Michael Best Strategies.
Hi, I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And we're the Insiders. And you may recall recently we were talking about whether or not the newly reelected governor and the newly reelected Republican majorities would actually be able to work together in some fashion in the upcoming session. And since then, the media has reported that they're actually talking to each other. So, Chuck, what are the possibilities of cooperation between the Republican legislature and the Democratic governor in the upcoming fight over the state budget and other policy matters?
I think they're much better than they were before. I think that the biggest challenge is whether Robin Vos, who's had enormous power, recognizes that this is his opportunity to do something in an environment where he could be in a much more challenging situation if for some reason they lose the Supreme Court race in the spring. And whether Governor Evers will use the leverage that he has as the governor of the state to be able to get something done. And here's why I think that is very different than it was when Governor Evers first came in, and why he's in a better position now. Governor Evers actually ended up having to sign a budget that had a lot of Republican dynamics in it 4 years ago, but he was in a very tough position and didn't have a lot of options. Why? Because Republicans had 8 years of doing exactly what they wanted with Scott Walker. They had majorities in both houses. They could do whatever they wanted. They needed nothing when Governor Evers took over 4 years ago. Now the dynamics have changed. There's a huge budget surplus. People will blame the Republicans if something isn't done here. Governor Evers is not up for re-election. He doesn't face any of that. But in 2 years, Republicans could face dramatically different maps, where his members who have faced these overwhelming Republican districts and really don't care what anybody else thinks, he could either lose his majority or have it pared down to 1 or 2 or 3 votes. That's really a dangerous situation for him to be in. Now, then the question is, where is there a possibility of getting it done? You can just see that Robin Vos has not made the transition yet. He says, yeah, we'll give some money for public education if you open it out to vouchers and no income limits. That is a non-starter. And although it's fine to state that publicly, that better not be what he's thinking about when he gets into the negotiations, because here's the difference. The dynamics have changed. The guy with something to lose in this budget is Robin Vos and the Republicans. The guy who has nothing to lose here is Governor Evers. The question is, can Robin Vos get over 10 years of totally being in charge, or 8 years of totally being in charge, and get to the point where he says, I need to recognize here that I need to compromise? That's the big thing. And then can Governor Evers wield the bully pulpit? And frankly, he should, he can, and I believe he will. That's the dynamic that I see. And then as far as the substance, it's going to have to come in, as it usually did in Wisconsin, even when Tommy Thompson was governor, over funding schools at a better level. Republicans control all those rural districts where their local schools are really important. And secondly, I think not an income tax cut. That's not going to fly with Governor Evers. A property tax cut. It's certainly not going to be LeMahieu's idea that we're going to get a cut in the top rate. He ought to kiss that one goodbye and get into the real world and get into some real discussions.
Well, you gave a promising opening, and then you said, but they can't seem to agree on anything here. I think, first of all, I think there will be agreement, and you can see how some things should be easy to get to agreement here. For instance, the Republican legislature passed on a bipartisan basis a redo of reading education in the state of Wisconsin, the way we teach reading all across the state. And Wisconsin's scores have unfortunately slipped to where now Mississippi students read as well as Wisconsin's students. That's mostly because Mississippi's rocketed up to near among the best in the country. But the governor vetoed a bill to redo reading education in Wisconsin, saying there's no money attached. Well, now we're sitting on a huge surplus. I mean, you can see how this deal could come together, where the bipartisan majority in both houses of the legislature get what they would like to redo reading education in the country, and the governor gets the amount of money he thinks is necessary to make that program work. I mean, so there are some things you can see how you could get to a deal on. The question is, can you get to a deal on really big things? And you're already saying no on some of these things. The Republicans have laid out, gee, we want an income tax cut and we'd like the expansion of school choice. The governor has said really only one thing so far, but he's still working on a budget and he'll have lots of things in there soon. But the main thing he has said is he wants more money for public schools. To me, I can see a trade in there. You suggest there's not one there, but I would point out that when you and I were deadlocked like this, when we couldn't agree on anything and wrote completely different versions of the state budget, in the end, after 100 days of yelling at each other, we were able to get to a point where I got the largest tax cut in the history of the state of Wisconsin at that point, and you got senior care, a drug program that provided that was a new entitlement in the state of Wisconsin. So I agreed to get my caucus to vote for a new healthcare entitlement, and you got your caucus to vote for the largest tax cut in state's history. Those things are possible when you have huge surpluses. There's always a way to make a deal. In fact, the Republicans should be able to get some of their tax cuts that they're interested in and some other things. The governor should be able to get more money for public schools and a bunch of other things that have been on his list for a while. There's got to be a way for them to make these big trades. I think the question is, you say Robin Vos has to break out of his pattern. I think the governor's office, who has never actually cut a deal with the legislature in 4 years, I really wonder if they have the skill set to do that. I hope that they do, because it's good for the state if we are able to accomplish both the priorities of Republicans and the priorities of Democrats. There's enough money to make that happen. The question is, are the players able to make it happen?
I think that's true, but let me add, there's one piece though there, Scott, that you've missed, and that you haven't articulated, and which I think is really critical. Who really has the incentive and needs to get this done more? I think the incentive is much more on the Republican side. They could be facing really dangerous maps for them in 2 years. And if they do, and they don't cut a deal, they will pay the price. They will pay the price in the general election in 2 years. It's going to be a high turnout election in a presidential year. So I'm afraid that that Robin Vos has not figured that out yet, and that'll be a problem. By the way, you should all know, because we are the insiders, Scott Jensen, I'll never forget when he walked into my office after we had cut a different deal on a budget. We had done a lot for K3 education, lower class size, et cetera, and did some really good things. Scott walked into my office and said, Chuck, we're going to be out there running on your education stuff. And, you're right, Scott, that these guys should cut a deal that everybody can run on. But the governor isn't up. He doesn't have to cut a deal. And it's starting to look really ugly to have this kind of money that's not going back. And I think the place where the action is on the compromises, they're all going to agree on doing something for public education. But the other piece that they need, I think that tax cut is going to have to come in property tax cuts. I know WMC hates that because they've already eliminated all the property taxes, M&E and all these other things, so businesses don't pay it. But guess what? That guy in rural Wisconsin, in Tomahawk, Merrill, Anago, those people, they pay property taxes. And I'll tell you what, if the Republicans cut that deal for a property tax cut and education, they'll be in good shape when these tight districts come in. If they don't, you can see a revolution out in those areas. They're not real happy that their schools are not being. By the way, I'm hearing a lot of rumblings too about emergency medical services, how that's being funded. There's been such a starvation on shared revenue and on school stuff. It's starting to become more of a problem. Right now, the Republicans are trying to blame it on the governor. That ain't working. And so we'll see. I think it's going to be a very interesting dynamic here. I agree with Scott entirely. They should be able to get a deal, but not on the terms the Republicans are thinking about right now. I guarantee you.
Well, it'll be a fascinating budget session coming up here.
It will be.
You've been listening to The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and Michael Best Strategies.